keen observer of global and international affairs, Noam Chomsky, in conversation with Jan Nederveen-Peterse, a Mellichamp Chair of Global Studies at UC Santa Barbara. This event is made possible in part through the cooperation of the Pollock Theater, and I want to thank Richard Hutton for making these facilities possible and for videotaping the event. And I would also thank the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, in particular David Krieger, the director, that made it possible to share Noam with us. Noam just gave the Kelly lecture last night for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation in downtown Santa Barbara. Jan has been given some questions and comments from our faculty and graduate students that will help to stimulate the conversation. And Noam has agreed to respond to questions that you might have for about 15 minutes or so at the end of the conversation. We'll have hand mics that you can speak into, so you might be thinking of things that you might like to ask Noam during the conversation. Jan, introduce the topic, and I want to thank all of you for coming for this very special event.
Mark, thanks. Good morning, everybody. A rainy day. Noam, thanks for joining us. You gave a great talk yesterday. Now, here's the strange thing. You are very well known. Yet, I think you're underestimated. Now, what is underestimated is your sense of humor. I'll give you a quote. The political spectrum in the United States, always very narrow, has been reduced to near invisibility.
Yes.
Here's another one. American policies with regard to Brazil in the 1950s. I quote, "We find it hard to induce people to accept our doctrine that the rich should plunder the poor, a public relations problem that had not yet been solved."
Not my quote. That's John Foster Dulles. The last sentence about the public relations problem is mine, but his comment, Dulles, was, "We find the communists have an advantage over us. We find it hard to, that they think that the poor should plunder the rich." That was his comment. And I say, we find it hard to convince people that the rich should plunder the poor.
Do you think this public relations issue has now been solved?
If it was, we wouldn't have global terrorism campaigns like Obama's drone campaign, 1,000 military bases around the world, overthrowing governments. Of course not. It's the same.
No, tomorrow there's a party for the 1% here in the neighborhood. We're in an era in which Hollywood celebrates idiots as culture heroes. Great Gatsby, Wolf of Wall Street. Is there good news for the 99%? And what kind of news would you be looking for?
Well, the good news is people like you, people who are interested in overcoming the extreme narrowness of the spectrum of political discussion that you talked about, the enormous inequities and oppression in the society. Last night, the people who are engaged in trying to end the extremely ominous threat of nuclear war and environmental catastrophe. That's the good news, but that's always been the good news.
Yes.
I mean, class war goes on all the time. It's usually one-sided. The business classes are very dedicated to class war. They never relent, constantly fighting it. And the question is whether there'll be an opposition. If there isn't, of course, they move forward, and you get periods like the last generation of vicious class war with no response. That's the general neoliberal assault on the population around the world. And you see rising opposition. That's the good news. Others are entering into the class war.
The counterpart to the plutocracy, the super rich, the 1% is the precariat, working in very precarious conditions, including those on part-time contracts, short-term contracts, migrants, unemployed youth, seniors without a pension. Do you see institutional improvements for them on the horizon?
Well, it's certainly true. I mean, from the point of view of those conducting the class war on the part of the business classes and the government closely linked to them, the best thing would be to have a population which is living a precarious existence. And this is not a secret, incidentally. It's very well understood by those waging war. So one of the clearest statements of it was by a man who used to be called St. Allen before 2007, when the system he carefully constructed crashed totally. Alan Greenspan, the former head of the
Federal Reserve.
Yeah, when he was testifying before Congress, late 80s, at the time when he was late 90s, he was testifying about the marvels of the terrific economy that he was running. He explained frankly that it was based on what he called a growing worker insecurity. Now, from the point of view of economists, that's a very healthy thing, because if workers are insecure, they're not going to ask for benefits, they're not going to strike, they're not going to call for an increase in wages, and you get a more healthy economy. That is an economy which is geared to what's called efficiency. It's an ideological, not an economic term, and concentration of wealth, and concentration of power, and marginalization of the population. So yes, growing worker insecurity is very healthy for the state of the economy, but also for the society in general. If you have a global precariat, let's say, then it's possible for the others. Actually, there's another term that corresponds to precariat, which should be brought in. That's plutonomy. Back around 2005, I think, Citibank produced a manual for investors, good advice for investors, and it described the way the world scene is changing. It said the world is being divided into a plutonomy and everyone else. Everyone else is the precariat. Plutonomy is a small sector, concentrated in the United States, but plenty of other places. England, by now China, India, so that even the poorest countries in the world, there are people who are rich to the point of, it's beyond extraordinary. So there is a global plutonomy with, of course, heavily concentrated. Then there's the precariat who live under conditions of insecurity, like, say, adjuncts in the universities or the tenants of the university system. It's very useful for those who run the university, whether it's the legislature or the trustees or whatever it happens to be. If you have a large number of temps doing the work, very low salaries, no hope of advancement, no possibility, or limited possibility of organizing. There is actually some, but not much. Then they're easy to control, and you get a higher efficiency in the ideological sense. So a world that's divided into plutonomy and the precariat would be a kind of a perfect world. If the precariat is willing to tolerate it, as always. Yep.
Last night, in your talk, you used the word "of course." And that word implies that there is a pattern, and we are to recognize that pattern. And in your work on language, you are interested in deep patterns, universal grammar. And in your work on politics, likewise, you're interested in patterns, kind of a grammar of politics, which you sum up or describe in very plain language as power, profit, and doublespeak. Now, in the sense that this is how hegemon states, corporations, and media behave. Of course. Now, in politics and economics, are there also questions that perplex you, that puzzle you, that fall outside the pattern, or for which you have not yet found a place in the pattern or a name to give it?
Well, plenty of them. In fact, I just gave a series of lectures at Columbia on philosophy department on one of them was on the theme of something I called 40 years ago, problems and mysteries. Problems, meaning by that a distinction between matters that we are in principle capable of understanding. We may not understand them, but they fall within our cognitive reach. You can imagine how we might understand them. Those are problems. Mysteries simply fall beyond our cognitive reach. And those are quite deep-seated. They're right in the physical sciences. They're not recognized enough, but if you look over the history of the physical sciences, and then when you get to the social sciences, this magnifies beyond real discussion. But at the core of the physical sciences, the hard physical sciences, there are mysteries for humans which are tacitly understood to be beyond the level of understanding, human understanding. There's classic moments of this. You take the early modern scientific revolution, which began basically with Galileo and his contemporaries, early 17th century. They wanted to overcome neo-scholastic mysticism going back to, with its Aristotelian origins. They were confronting a scientific world in which explanations were given in terms of what were called occult forces, sympathies, antipathies, things fall to the ground because that's their natural place, so on and so forth. They wanted to give real, Galileo and others wanted to give real explanations. And they had a concept of explanation, of intelligibility, namely, there had to be a mechanical explanation of the world, had to be accounted for as a machine. And by machine, they meant something very concrete, something that an artisan could build, something with gears and levers and so on and so forth. And in fact, it was supposed to have been built by a super skilled artisan. So an intelligible account for, say, Galileo would be an account in terms of mechanical principles. It's called the mechanical philosophy. And philosophy just meant science in those days. So mechanical science. The world is a machine. Galileo recognized that he was incapable. He lamented at the end of his life. He'd been incapable of accounting for the motions of the planets, the tides, and so on in mechanical terms. So this was not yet understood, but the concept of intelligibility was clear. This goes through the next century. The great scientists, Huygens, Descartes, Leibniz, Newton, all believed in the mechanical philosophy. And then a problem happened. And Newton discovered that it's false. The famous body-mind problem is based on the assumption that body is explicable in mechanical terms. Mind, Descartes recognized that there are things that aren't explicable in mechanical terms. Actually, the main one was normal use of language for good reasons, in fact. But so that was the basis of mind. You have these two substances. Newton showed there are no bodies. He showed that nothing is explicable in mechanical terms. There are no machines. This is totally misunderstood, especially in the social sciences, where it's assumed that Newton showed that the world operates by mechanical principles. It's a big machine. He showed the opposite. He showed that you cannot account for it in mechanical terms. Newton regarded this as a complete absurdity. He said no person with any scientific intelligence could accept this, and he spent the rest of his life trying to overcome it. He had various... the problem was, how can you account for action at a distance, interaction without contact? So how can it be that if I move my hand, I move the moon? There's no contact. That's the mystical force. But he was correct. It was an absurdity, but it was true. And it points to something that goes beyond the level of human intelligence. How can we deal with a world that's based on occult forces that we cannot comprehend? We have to accept them because they're true, but we can't comprehend them. Well, what happened, and this was well understood by his contemporaries, by John Locke, later David Hume, right through the 18th century. Since then, it's been forgotten. The concept of science simply limited its goals. Sciences since Newton have not attempted to develop an intelligible account of the universe. They've lowered the goals to trying to develop theories that are intelligible. That's a much lower goal. But to understand a theory is one thing. To understand what it's talking about is another thing. But that goal has been abandoned. Well, there's a dramatic example of something beyond the level of human intelligence. And it goes on from there. When you go into more complicated things than basic physics, it expands all over the place. So, for example, human choice or animal choice is completely unintelligible to us. I mean, you can't deny that it happens. We all know perfectly well that we make choices and we make decisions. But it's not beyond the range of existing science. No one has a coherent idea of how you could explain it. Probably because it lies beyond the bounds of human cognitive capacities. I mean, if you think of the things we can understand, they pretty much reduce to determinism and randomness. So we understand things being determined, like a machine. You turn a lever and something else turns. Or a thermostat. I mean, that kind of thing we understand. The concept of random behavior, that was understood in the 17th century. Some things just happen randomly. But suppose something falls beyond the bounds of determinacy and randomness. Well, it's beyond our cognitive capacities. And that's what will and choice seem to be like. So it's not hard to find things of the kind you're talking about.
Maybe it's a good idea to talk about something simpler like neoliberalism.
That's much simpler. That's easy to understand. Actually, it's misnamed.
The very idea of a struggle that is fought on only one side is interesting. Here's a question though. When we criticize neoliberalism, we must show its contradictions and its limitations, because otherwise we do ourselves a disservice and we play for the wrong team. The outside of neoliberalism, as I see it, includes Nordic capitalism, my old neighborhood, and I know it well, and part of emerging economies, emerging societies, elements of it. Not in the sense that these are rose gardens, but in the sense that they are different and the differences are robust. Do you share that view?
Partly, but I think we ought to take a closer look at the concept. Neoliberalism, first of all, is not new and it's not liberal. Yeah. So the term neoliberalism already is propaganda. Yeah. It's very old, old-fashioned class war, old-fashioned imperialism. Neoliberalism is basically the programs that were imposed on what became the Third World. You go back to the 18th century, actually the 17th century, the main industrial and commercial centers of the world were India and China. And the difference between the very rich and the very poor was not very great, maybe 3 to 1 in different countries. But something happened then. The main thing that happened is that what was called then liberalism was imposed on the colonized regions. They were compelled to follow market principles. The rich never did. The rich do not tolerate markets for themselves for very good reasons. They're too destructive. So this, first England and the United States and Germany, France, the rest of the developed countries, Japan, imposed highly state-directed forms of development. The United States was quite striking. You probably all know this history, but it's worth bearing in mind. When the colonies were liberated, they got advice on sound economics from the greatest economists of the day, like Adam Smith. And the advice was, follow the principles of sound economics, what we call neoliberalism. Don't have tariffs, no protection, because that, you can prove, interferes with maximal efficiency. For the colonies, that meant use British manufactured goods, which are much better than yours. Concentrate on what you're good at, what later came to be called comparative advantage. So produce agricultural product, raw materials, agricultural products, fish, fur, and so on, and take superior British manufactured goods. Crucially, don't try to monopolize the commodities for which you have a natural advantage. And the most important one in those days, of course, was cotton. Cotton was kind of like the oil of the early industrial revolution. What did the colonies do? Exactly the opposite in every respect. Very high tariffs, block superior British manufacturers, develop your own textile industry later in the century, the steel industry, blocking superior British products and so on, all the way across the line. A massive state intervention in the economy, the railroads, the conquest of the territory, extermination of the population, conquest of half of Mexico, slavery, which is the most extreme interference with market principles you can think of. Monopoly efforts, strong efforts to monopolize cotton. The Mexican War was fought largely to try to, and the annexation of Texas, to try to obtain a monopoly of cotton. Actually, the presidents are very explicit about this. The Jacksonian presidents, Tyler, Polk, he said, yes, if we can gain a monopoly of cotton, we can bring England to our feet. Remember, England was the big enemy. That was the powerful military state who was blocking U.S. expansion. The U.S. couldn't conquer Canada, couldn't conquer Cuba. The British were just too strong. But we could bring Britain to our feet if we could monopolize cotton. And it came pretty close. And of course, over the century, the relations of power shifted. Now, that's how the United States developed, right to the present. If you have a computer, use the internet, fly an airplane, use pharmaceuticals, you're using the products substantially created in the dynamic state sector of the economy, right to the present. Well, that's how the United States developed. It's the way England developed before it. It stole technology from the Low Countries, which were more advanced, from Ireland, from India, of course, and used methods that are now blocked by the World Trade Organization and called piracy to develop, and it became the most powerful industrial state, and in fact, essentially without exception. I mean, there's city-states like Hong Kong are minor exceptions, but this is the pattern of development of the rich societies. Meanwhile, market systems were forced down the throat of the poor, and they became the third world. That's neoliberalism. It's now an effort. So how is it applying to the Nordic capitalism? Same way. Europe right now is in the midst of an extremely interesting process by which Europe is becoming extremely undemocratic. The Wall Street Journal, for example, not a great radical journal, pointed out recently that something which is correct. If you take a look at European countries, no matter what government is in power, they follow exactly the same policies. It could be a communist-run government, the government of the left, the government of the right. They follow pretty much the same policies because the policies are dictated from Brussels. The policies are determined by Brussels bureaucrats and Bundesbank and so on. The Nordic countries are resisting a little, but it's being imposed by force on the South. And what it's doing is take this policy of austerity during recession. I mean, even the IMF by now recognizes that it's ludicrous from an economic point of view. The IMF economists have been publishing papers recently saying, it's crazy, it's a way to destroy an economy. But they understand that. But destroying the economy is not a bad objective, because the goal, remember, is to establish a plutocracy and precariat. The goal is class war, and that means undermine and dismantle the welfare state. And the Nordic countries are partially bending to this, Sweden, Norway, and so on. They're holding back. But it's the old policy it's basically a policy of class war, which is constantly falling.
China, Brazil, Taiwan.
Well, that's an interesting story. Over the last generation, the neoliberal program, sometimes called the Washington Consensus, have been imposed on large parts of the world, but there has been resistance. One region of resistance was East Asia. Most of East Asia. East and Southeast Asia have somewhat resisted this. That's why you get the great growth period. They did not accept the rules of the Washington Consensus, neoliberal rules. So, for example, take, say, South Korea had a remarkable industrial development, and Taiwan too, by completely rejecting the rules. They're very much the way the American colonies had, or Britain had before it, or Japan had after the Meiji Restoration. Just violate the rules radically, so radically that in South Korea, for example, export of capital was not only blocked, but you could get the death penalty for it. They weren't fooling around. And yes, they developed, although it's backing off now in many ways. The other region that's extremely significant, I think, is South America. And that's the last decade. South America was a loyal follower of the rules, and it had two devastating decades of falling to pieces under neoliberal rules, the usual result. But in the early, around 2000, it began to move in a separate direction. And by now, South America is substantially independent. And that's, I think, a change of really historical significance. That's the first time in 500 years, since the conquistadors arrived, that South America has largely freed itself from imperial domination. Last century or so, that's meant U.S. domination. And it's pretty remarkable the way it's in economic terms, it's correct, but in other terms too. So, for example, there was a striking illustration of this was a couple of months ago. There was a study by the Open Society Forum of participation in rendition. Rendition is the most extreme form of torture. That's the form in which, that's U.S. policy in which instead of torturing people yourself, you send them to your favorite dictator, Assad, Mubarak, and they'll torture them for you and get out the information you want or whatever you want to get from them. That's rendition. It's the most extreme form of torture that anybody's ever devised. This was a study of which countries participated in it. And the results were quite interesting. Most of Europe participated, including the Nordic countries like Sweden. They participated participated actively in ultra torture. The Middle East, of course, because that's where you send people to be tortured. Most of Canada, the United States, obviously. One region of the world did refuse to participate, South America, which is doubly remarkable. For one thing, it used to just follow U.S. orders. And secondly, while it did, it was the center of world torture. That's a very striking result. And it's showing up in other ways, too. If you take a look at hemispheric conferences in the Western Hemisphere, by now, the United States and Canada are almost totally isolated. The last hemispheric conference was in Cartagena, Colombia. They could never reach consensus on anything because there was a split between the United States and Canada on the one side, the rest of the hemisphere on the other, on the two major issues. One major issue was admission of Cuba into the Western Hemisphere. South of the border, almost unanimously in favor of it. U.S. and Canada refused. The other major issue was drugs. South of the border, they want to move towards decriminalization. Some are going even farther. The United States and Canada refused. For the U.S. and Canada, the drug war is very essential. It's basically a race war, and it's, you know, the consequences, and they want to hang on to it. Well, you know, by now, the U.S. and Canada are almost excluded from the hemisphere. And this is just a dramatic change if you think about recent history, not so recent history of hundreds of years. So yes, there is resistance. Actually, going back to East and Southeast Asia, if you'll notice, there's one country of the region that has not participated in the Great Growth Period, the Philippines. The one country that has been under U.S. control for a century is not one of the Asian tigers.
Must be the Haiti of Asia then. Must be the Haiti of Asia. Now, shall we go to questions from the floor? Good, shall we? Please. Here, here's a mic. Here's a mic.
Hello. What are your thoughts on the ongoing talks between John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov on the so-called Syrian civil war?
Syrian civil war. Well, that's a really tragic situation. Syria is simply plunging into suicide. And it's not easy to think of anything to do about it. At least I haven't heard anything sensible. The country is moving towards, it seems to be moving towards partition. The Kurdish areas have become pretty much autonomous. Assad has left them alone. There's battles going on between the Kurds and the wide array of rebel forces. They're a unified group. And the Kurds have gradually established a region where they pretty much control it, not totally. In fact, they even declared autonomy. They'll probably try to link themselves up with Iraqi Kurdistan, which is pretty near autonomous. But that's tricky because Barzani, at the head of Iraqi Kurdistan, is opposed to the Syrian Kurds. He's trying to make a deal with Turkey for all kind of economic reasons. And a deal with Turkey means suppressing the Kurds. The Kurds, like most groups, have plenty of internal battles. And how that'll work out is not so obvious, but that's one part of Syria. The rest of Syria is simply being partitioned. There's a part that's being increasingly controlled by the Assad forces, backed by Iran, Russia, Hezbollah. The other part is under the control of myriad rebel groups which are fighting among themselves. Meanwhile, the Syrian people are being decimated. It's just devastating. A huge number of refugees. The refugees issue is a very striking issue. It's interesting to see the way it's discussed in the United States. Here we have what's called a huge immigration problem. We've got these people coming in Mayan community. These are people coming from Guatemala, the Mayan highlands. Why are they coming to the fleeing? Well, you know, the region was subjected to a genocidal war, which the U.S. supported. Reagan was a strong supporter of it. Places destroyed, so people flee, come to the rich country, so it's illegal refugees. We have to deport them. Others are coming from Mexico, largely as a result of NAFTA. Predictable effect of NAFTA was wipe out Mexican agriculture. So what happens next? Okay, so we have these illegal immigrants. Obama has broken all records. He's deported almost 2 million of them. That's the U.S. Now, there are other countries, like, say, Lebanon and Jordan and Syria and Iran, where they absorb refugees, huge numbers of them. I mean, Lebanon, for example, is a country of 4 million people. It has about 700,000 Palestinians, and by now about 1 million Syrians. Okay, for the poor countries, they're supposed to absorb refugees, actually absorb the refugees that we generate. So the attack on Iraq created, nobody knows, maybe 1.5 million, 2 million refugees. Okay, they're absorbed in the neighboring countries like then Syria, Jordan, Iran, Lebanon. That's their job. Their job is to absorb the refugees that we generate. Our job is to drive out the refugees who we generate. And this is discussed, it's not, the enormity of this, it doesn't even begin to be discussed. I mean, maybe you can't do much for Syria. I don't know of a good proposal, but at least we could be taking care of the refugees. I mean, this, you know, it's about 1 million of them in Lebanon. Why should Lebanon support them? We should support them. In fact, the battle in Syria has become a part of the growing Sunni-Shia war around the whole region. That was inflamed by the United States. I mean, in Iraq, you know, there's been simmering conflicts, but there was never a sharp Sunni-Shia conflict until after the U.S. invasion, which created it. Now it's spread over the region. It's devastating large parts of the region. We have a large share of responsibility for it. We're the ones who should be supporting. Well, these are things you could do. But apart from that, if anybody has a suggestion, I haven't heard it. In fact, about the only proposal that makes any sense is the Lakhdar Brahimi initiative through the United Nations, which Russia has supported, and going back, Kerry has mildly supported. It's a thin reed, you know, not easy to see how it could work, but there's no other proposal that I know of.
Sebastian?
Hello. In Europe, do you see a way out of the spiral of austerity, and do you think it could come from democratizing the EU processes?
In the EU? Democratizing the EU? Sure. I mean, Europeans don't have to accept this policy. I mean, they have pretty much, there's plenty of resistance, like in Spain and Greece, other parts of Europe, there's substantial resistance. It has not yet been enough to abort, it's been enough to somewhat restrict the policy. So the harshest policies of imposing austerity have been somewhat softened. And by now the European Bank is a little more progressive in its reaction to this. I mean, it's kind of hard to realize, but the United States has been more progressive than Europe since 2008. And the European Bank is kind of backing off a little bit from its harsh policies because of the resistance. So sure, it can be overcome. Greece, it's there's significant movements against it. Greece, of course, is being punished worse than most, and the same with Spain. But it's well within the capacity of the Europeans to protect the achievements of the past generation. I mean, after all, the European welfare state is not a trivial contribution to Western civilization, and it's being dismantled consciously, and it could be protected. Of course, you can go beyond that. That's not the limit by any means. So yes, it's I don't. I mean, it's really a limit of will and commitment. Same here. I mean, we don't tolerate what's going on here.
We would keep this 40 minutes. We are a few minutes over time, Noam. Is that okay?
Sure.
No, please.
Well, I asked you a question last night, and let me ask a more critical question, but at the start making a statement, I believe I have a solution to the question that you asked. Do we have any problem, any solution for Syria? Yes, I think we do.
Very brief, please.
Yeah, but as long as in this country we have 94 senators, 219 congressmen that receive money from agency that was recognized in 1963 as a tool of the Israeli government, IAPAC, we are not going anywhere. We have surrendered our foreign policy entirely.
It's a very convenient view in the United States. Convenient because it directs attention away from the centers of power in the United States. And anything that directs attention away from the centers of power is almost guaranteed to be popular. This is a common view. It's understandable. There are leading scholars who've advocated it. John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt are the main ones. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, you're right that many of the people in Congress get benefits from AIPAC, but practically 100% of them are in the pockets of the funders, the corporate sector. That's how they got elected. There's a very close correlation between campaign funding and electoral victory. Very close. In fact, in the House of Representatives, it's almost a straight line. A few deviants here and there, like Bernie Sanders, but it's almost uniform. And this is big money. It's not AIPAC. AIPAC's an ethnic lobby, it's of some significance, but it doesn't begin to compare with the major lobbies. I mean, the military lobby itself could put AIPAC out of business in 2 minutes if they wanted. It's way more powerful. Why don't they do it? They don't want to. Yeah. They support AIPAC's policies. They benefit from it. Take, say, Lockheed Martin. When the United States gives $3 billion of aid to Israel, it's called aid for purchase of military equipment, a lot of that goes right back to Lockheed Martin in two ways. First of all, they get paid for developing, the F-135 and so on. They get paid by the U.S. taxpayer via Israel. Secondly, when we give a couple of $1 billion of military aid to Israel, Saudi Arabia comes along and says, we want 10 times as much for ourselves. And Lockheed Martin isn't very happy to provide Saudi Arabia with second-rate equipment, which they don't know how to operate anyhow. They're getting a $60 million aid grant as compared with Israel's $3 billion. All terrific for the military, directly for military industry. Furthermore, there are extremely close interactions. Some of you may have seen one of the most important leaks from WikiLeaks. Didn't get much publicity. It was quite important. It was a list of a Pentagon list of strategic sites, super high value strategic sites around the world that have to be protected, above all else. One of them was Rafael Military Industries, right outside Haifa, major military complex, closely integrated with the U.S. military. It's one of the places where drone technology was developed, for example. It's so closely integrated that Rafael transferred its management offices to Washington. It's an Israeli industry. Its offices are in Washington because that's where the money is. that's just symptomatic of extremely close relations. High-tech industry in the United States, like say IBM and so on, they're increasing their investments in Israel, not because they love Jews. It's just a good place for them to invest. Actually, Warren Buffett just spent a couple $1 billion picking up some industry there and said it's the best place to invest outside the United States. And it's close intelligence connections and so on. So why doesn't the military lobby stand against AIPAC? Because they support the policy. They do. The same is true of other sectors. And in fact, when the U.S. opposes Israeli policy, which happens regularly, AIPAC disappears. In fact, it's happening right now in front of our eyes. AIPAC's leading goal was to try to get the Senate to pass legislation that would essentially block the Iran-U.S. negotiations.
But
They failed. Pardon?
But who created two proxy war? As long as we fought for two proxy war, that is of benefit to the military-industrial complex that is only filling the pockets of the rich. That's the benefit.
Yeah, that's true, but that's nothing to do with AIPAC. Nothing.
Yes.
I mean, it's, in this particular case, AIPAC backed off, but it's happened over and over. I mean, even George W. Bush, very pro-Israel, there was one point at which there was a real conflict with Israel. Israel's a military-based economy, high-tech military production. They want export markets. The big export market, of course, is China. So they've been dying to get into the China market. U.S. won't let them. The most recent occasion was 2005 under Bush, when Israel was trying to upgrade the missiles for China, and the U.S. Bush administration said, you can't do it. They said they were going to do it anyway, at which point the U.S. came down on them like a ton of bricks. It blocked visits from high-level Israeli officials. They were not allowed to visit the United States. They were compelled to issue a formal apology for having tried to do this and to pass legislation blocking it. A real humiliation. You didn't hear a peep from AIPAC out of this. The reason is they're not idiots. They know they cannot confront U.S. power, and when there is a conflict, they back down. This happens time after time. For a time, I could give you a long list. So there's good reasons for, but I think we should be cautious initially about any proposal that directs attention away from the centers of American power. It's always going to be convenient to accept a proposal like that. Doesn't prove that it's wrong, but it's an initial reason for skepticism, I think.
One more question.
Hi, thank you, Professor Chomsky. In terms of reigniting the democratic processes here at home, what role do you think whistleblowing has to play?
What?
Whistleblowing. What role do you think? Reigniting the democratic process here.
Reigniting democracy.
Also, do you think whistleblowing will ever be institutionalized so that people like Snowden or journalists like Glenn Greenwald don't have to run away for their lives?
Sure, we should try to democratize the society. It's not impossible after all. I mean, there used to be a quip, maybe it went back to C. Wright Mills, I don't recall, that the United States is a one-party state, business party, with two factions, the Democrats and the Republicans, which are different. It's not entirely true anymore. It's still a one-party state, the business party, but there's only one faction, and it's not Democrats. It's moderate Republicans. The people who are, the Democratic Party today is overwhelmingly what used to be called moderate Republicans. But meanwhile, the Republican Party, so-called, has just drifted totally off the spectrum. They're not part of the parliamentary system anymore. That's actually recognized by the most prestigious conservative commentators. example, Norman Ornstein, famous conservative political analyst for the American Enterprise Institute, right-wing. He simply describes the Republican Party today as a radical insurgency, which has abandoned parliamentary principles. And you can see it in the last 8 years. Their only policies have been, of course, to enrich the super rich and to block anything that's done in Washington, period. That's been very successful, remarkably successful. This report came out, I think, yesterday in the New York Times of the looking at recent polls and this, and they're very interesting. Turns out that talking about the midterm elections that are coming up, there are a lot of polls about it. The public largely supports the policies of the Democrats, which the Democrats themselves don't support, but the supposed like higher taxes on the rich and Medicare and so on. Public supports those. At the same time, the public prefers the Republicans. And when you looked at the reasons, it's because the public is infuriated about what's called dysfunctional Washington. Now, the press is always talking about this. Gridlock in Washington. Dysfunctional Washington. Dysfunctional Washington means the Republicans are committed to block anything that happens. Okay, so it's dysfunctional Washington blamed on Democrats. Public prefers the Republicans, but opposes their policies. Okay, this is really clever politics. It makes people believe there's a political system. People are driven into acting in extremely irrational ways. It's not the first time. So, for example, in 2012, there were 2012 elections. There were polls, a ton of polls go on. They're very interesting. On attitudes towards policy issues and towards political preferences. And it's striking to see how they separate. So, for example, one major study of Southern Tea Party people, that category, people identify themselves that way. Most of them are social democrats. They support higher spending on health, on education, on aid to the poor, not welfare, because Reagan demonized that, but aid to the poor, things like that. But higher taxes on the rich. But at the same time, they support the Republican Party, which is exactly the opposite. It's you take a place like actually there was a study of California recently, which investigated attitudes towards what they call big government, taxes and stuff. There was a very close correlation between the amount of aid that people got from the federal government and their opposition to the federal government. So when you get to the rural, poor areas, they're getting an awful lot of aid from the federal government, and they want to get the government off their backs. To try to instill these kinds of attitudes into people is a real achievement. And that's still, to get back to your first point, to the 99%. You can overcome this. This is not like fighting the secret police. You don't get thrown into prisons for getting people to understand these things. This is an opportunity for real organizing work, which can be done.
Cherish you for your contributions. People love you for